Some 3 years ago now, there was a live stream hosted by Sri Lebekan, the rabbi from another planet, on his channel. A live stream in which he talked to a fan that he'd had an altercation with on Twitter. A fan of Doctor Who, who was very much a fan of Jodie's Doctor, and very much a fan of the Jodie Whittaker era. They'd had a clash on Twitter, and the rabbi, being the rabbi, kind of said to this fan, well, look, if you feel this strongly about, that I'm wrong, and you feel this strongly about, your love of the current era of Doctor Who, do you want to come on live stream and discuss it with me and hash it out with me there? We can actually have a discussion. I'm open to talking to the other side about this. And so, the rabbi decided to host this stream in which they both had this very adversarial discussion about the Jodie Whittaker era. And one of the episodes that came up was the episode Kablam. It's a story in which the Doctor, Jodie's Doctor, has to deal with this industrial terrorist who's booby-trapped various delivery packages. Kablam is basically this intergalactic delivery service. And there's an industrial terrorist in Kablam who's booby-trapped various packages to explode on contact with their customers. But Jodie programs the robots to detonate the devices, in the safety of the warehouse. But the terrorist is so distraught and so defeated that he ends up, walking into the crowd of robots and choosing oblivion, essentially. And Yaz tries to call to him and say, come on, you need to get out of there, don't throw your life away. But Jodie decides to press the button while he's in there. And the rabbi pointed to that and said that's very undoctorish. The Doctor wouldn't just kill this guy when there was a chance to save him and when he'd already been defeated. And this is when this Jodie fan actually challenged the rabbi. If you're a Jewish Israeli citizen and you live with Hamas at your doorstep, why would you ever want the Doctor to save the life of a terrorist? And the rabbi was making the point, I believe the Doctor should negotiate. A negotiation would be better. And he did say, yes, we deal with terrorists at our doorstep, terrorists who want to kill us. Yes, here in Israel we deal with terrorists who want to kill us all. And we've learned over time, the people of Israel have learned that unfortunately, if they're at your doorstep, all you can do is try to negotiate with them and try to understand that this is the Middle East. Everyone wants to annihilate everyone else. There's a lot of annihilationist rhetoric, there's a lot of brinkmanship, there's a lot of unhinged leaders out there, and you've got to kind of navigate that in the warped, strange way that the Middle East does navigate that. But especially if you're a Jewish state and you're surrounded by, regimes that are very anti-Semitic indeed, and terrorist groups that absolutely resent the fact that your nation exists. Because Israel has not just had to deal with Hamas as a terrorist group in the past. It's had to deal with the PLO. It's had to deal with predecessors to Hamas, like the PLO. Israel kind of over time did manage to bring the PLO to the negotiating table somehow. But Hamas are kind of a very different kettle of fish. But still, the rabbi was saying, well, look, we have to have faith that negotiation can work. And in a way, I think it was almost kind of making the case for why the rabbi is a Doctor Who fan. He believes very strongly in the values of the Doctor. The peace and negotiation are better than war, essentially. The Israel-Palestine issue is complicated, and a lot of people tend to say, well, look, it's a complicated issue. Each side has their grievances. Each side has committed their sins, as it were. I don't really want to take a side. I don't know enough about the situation to take a side. But then the 7th of October happened, and Hamas militants entered Israel and went on a killing spree. They also took hostages. They managed to breach, mainland Israel. We saw the images. Images were plastered on social media. Some of the Hamas militants actually live streamed what they were doing. And they took hostages. They murdered over 1,000 innocent Israeli citizens, including children. They murdered them in the most barbaric way. It defies all sense. It defies all reason. It defies all humanity, really. Hamas basically live streamed and took photographs of what they did. for all to see. There were horrific reports of Hamas murdering children, beheading babies. They took hostages as well. They subjected them to the most horrific, depraved humiliation and indignity. There are a lot of people who said, you know what, I didn't take a side until now, but now after seeing the depravity of Hamas and what Hamas, having seen the depravity of that footage, there's no way I'm going to take any other side than Israel's in this. Hamas are just absolute butchers. They're monsters, and I hope Israel obliterates them. The threat of Hamas is what I would say pushes the Overton window very rightward in Israeli politics. There are even people who used to be behind the idea of a peaceful resolve, of a two-state solution, who said that this latest attack has disillusioned them. There are some who even say, as a result of this attack, the two-state solution is pretty much dead now. This is a watershed moment. It's where we realize just how much our enemies hate us and what it would mean if we lowered our defenses to them even a little bit. This is what they could do in a day. So a lot of the voices for peace are kind of disillusioned now and saying, you know what, I believed in peace, and now Hamas have done this, and I don't know what I believe anymore. Now, Doctor Who is, I suppose, quite a trivial thing, but to a lot of its fans, it isn't. To a lot of its fans, the ideals of the show are not anything trivial. The ideals of the show are very precious ones, very important ones. The show is about a figure, a heroic figure, the Doctor, who believes in very left-wing causes, believes in peace, believes in abhors violence, abhors war, abhors intolerance, and he's always a champion of social justice, and he's always a champion of peace and finding a peaceful resolve to problems. And so a lot of people a lot of fans, young fans who kind of came into the show in 2005 and were drawn to that kind of a hero who stood for peace and stood for a respect for life in all its forms, a respect for the sanctity of life in all its forms. A lot of them would probably feel that, a lot of them would probably keep the faith in that idealism of the Doctor. And I'm going to look at this particular tweet to talk about why this kind of concerns Doctor Who fandom. It may seem like a trivializing of a horrific, complex global event, but I hope as this goes on you'll understand why I'm talking about this. Right. It concerns this tweet. This tweet made by a Doctor Who fan account on Twitter who has made a statement about his feeling on the current horrific conflict going on in Israel and Gaza. And he says, "My heart is with the people of Palestine. What's been happening in their country for the last 70 years has been barbaric. It's heartbreaking to see genocide and ethnic cleansing happening under our eyes. I'm using my platform in ways you could help. Free Palestine." Now, there are parts of that tweet I can get behind. There's parts I would be very cautious about getting behind. Like the tweeter, I am heartbroken about what's going to happen to the Palestinian people at the moment in this war. This war that Hamas has brought on its own people. And then there's a photograph they posted, which is the more partisan part of this tweet. The part that's just saying, they're saying it's a simple issue, and it's a simple question of whether you're on the right side or the wrong side. The part that's contentious about this tweet is, of course, it makes no mention of the fact that that terrorist attack happened in Israel. It commemorates the victims in Palestine, but it says nothing for what Israel suffered. And that's no light thing, really. They just don't want war. I mean, I don't really want war, but I'm resigned to the fact that Israel can't be seen not to retaliate. Israel has to retaliate. It can't be seen not to retaliate. If it doesn't retaliate, then that's going to be taken as a permission slip by Hamas to carry on attacking, carry on making horrific terrorist attacks like this again and again. And, you know, it's just going to be an invitation for more from them. And that's something that the Israeli people would not stand for. The Israeli people would not stand for Israel doing nothing to defend them after this absolute horror of what happened. Now, my fear, however, is that I think Hamas are going to somehow survive this. They're slippery, they're cowardly, they're horrid. And they're very adept at using their people as human shields and escaping into the crowd, whilst the innocent people of Gaza bear the brunt. And so I think in the end, a lot of innocent people are going to die for no good reason. And not much is going to be achieved from it. It's going to be a failure. That's what I fear. The biggest problem with this conflict, which I think, you know, tweeters like this are completely ignoring, is that the concern about the humanitarian crisis, this would not be half the humanitarian price. This would not be half the humanitarian crisis it's going to be if Hamas were genuinely trying to safeguard the humanitarian needs of their people. But Hamas don't care. Hamas are willing to use their people as cannon fodder and put them in harm's way just to tarnish Israel, just to disgrace Israel. And I would say yes, you know, sensible voices on the left should be denouncing Hamas, but they never do. Some on the left just are convinced that Hamas are just a legitimate resistance group. You know, that they're just defending their people from Israel. And what leaves a bit of a nasty aftertaste is, of course, that, you know, it's all pointing the finger at Israel for the terrible things it's done, and no acknowledgement of the fact that Hamas has done something horrific. Now, I'm going to kind of try and... What this video is going to vaguely be about is the fact that a basic refutation of the idea that this is a simple conflict. But this is a contentious tweet. It's certainly become a contentious tweet. And I'm going to kind of try and talk about why it has. Now, in fairness, there's no mention of Hamas at all, so there's no explicit endorsement of Hamas. It's not, you know, this tweet is not saying, like a lot of people on the left are saying, that, oh, Hamas are a legitimate resistance group. You know, they're freedom fighters, or any of that nonsense you'll often hear from the left about Hamas. There's none of that, but there's no... It's a complete whitewash of the atrocity that the Israeli people suffered on the 7th, and that is positively chilling to me. It's hard not to find that as chilling. And now finally there's this particular billboard, and I think, again, it's a whitewashing of any crimes of Hamas and a focus completely on the crimes of Israel. But the most important thing is it's telling you this is simple. It's simple whose side you should be on. It's simple who are the bad guys in here. It's very much simplifying it, and I think this is a far too complex issue to simplify. But the reason I'm doing this video is, you know, like I said, this tweet is about simplifying the issue, and it's not a simple issue. But the very fact that it's, you know, Doctor Who fans talking about this issue is what Safe Space Who is kind of talking about here is the idea, or tapping into it rather, is the idea that if you're a Doctor Who fan, if you're a fan of Doctor Who, then this is the stance you need to take. This is the stance you should take. This is the stance that the Doctor would take, for that matter. There's the idea that, particularly the younger fans who came into Doctor Who, the idea that, if Doctor Who was a core part of your identity and you strongly identify with the idealistic Doctor, and the Doctor as a hero, stands for tolerance and peace and, very abhors violence, abhors war, then, you tend to think, well, the stance I should take is the stance that the show tells me is the right stance to take. And, it's this idea that, I don't want to take a stance that my fellow fans would see as disgraceful, or for that matter, which the Doctor would see as disgraceful. I know the Doctor's not a real figure, but he is a figure that fans look up to as the moral ideal, and there's the idea that a lot of fans are feeling, well, if I take the wrong side in this, then does that make me a bad fan? Does that make me someone that the Doctor would be disappointed in? Would he see me as the enemy, the typical warmonger in this? Would I be an affront to his values if I took the wrong side? And like I said, the show would, and it's clear what, looking at this on face value, what side would the Doctor take? Well, the Doctor is anti-war, so inevitably it's hard to imagine any incarnation of the Doctor, not even the Sixth Doctor, being okay with this. They wouldn't look at the devastation of Hamas and they wouldn't look at the devastation of Gaza and think that's any good thing. They'd be horrified at what Israel is doing at the moment. If they arrived on the scene right now, obviously that's the judgment they would make. This would be horrifying to the Doctor. This would be heartbreaking to the Doctor. And so there is the idea of, like I said, it's this idea of, placing your identity, staking your identity in Doctor Who and the morals of Doctor Who. And this tweet is kind of, embodying that point, the point of, well, this is what we're, as fans, we're supposed to believe. This is the stance we're supposed to take as Doctor Who fans, that, the war, Israel's war is wrong. Israel is in the wrong completely. And it's, Palestine, they are the victims. They're the underdog and we should stand with them. But, like I said, this is a Doctor Who Twitter account, and in a very kind of stark and bold way, they are saying, if you're a Doctor Who fan, this is the stance you should take. And that's, I think, what a lot of fans would feel in this, is the feeling that, well, I need to take the right stance in this. I need to take the stance that the Doctor would take in this, if I take the wrong stance in this, does that make me a bad fan? Does that make me someone that the Doctor would abhor? Would the Doctor be, would the Doctor be disappointed in me? And this is if you're a fan who very much kind of places your identity in being a Doctor Who fan and identifying with the ideals of the Doctor. And it's very hard for the Doctor to imagine a situation where the Doctor would look at this, at the devastation of Gaza, and being anything but horrified and heartbroken at it. The Doctor would obviously stand against this. He'd stand against war. He'd stand against, the human suffering that comes from Israel's actions. He would argue there's a better way that Israel could solve its problems with Hamas. And, the feeling is, well, that's what the Doctor would do. And I think a lot of fans feel, well, I wouldn't want to disappoint the Doctor, and obviously a lot of fans would look at me, a lot of other fans would look at me quizzically if I took any other stance. They think, well, how can you think that way and be a fan of this show? Have you learned nothing from this show?
You four people in this church, in this corner of planet Earth, you have to be the best of humanity.
I'm kind of doing this video because I feel like young fans who feel that's what they have to do are kind of in a very difficult position indeed. Fans like that are in a bit of a catch-22 situation because let's take a look at a different fan reaction. And this is by Ian Levine. Ian Levine is himself Jewish. There was a major march in London, of protesters demanding a ceasefire, demanding that Israel ends the violence and demanding a ceasefire. But Ian Levine has said, "I am deeply, deeply disturbed. Every weekend a vile, hateful, anti-Semitic mob descends upon London, but the government and police do nothing to stop it. This is becoming like Nazi Germany all over again. It must be stopped." Now, the thing is, what Ian is saying is nothing idle. Some of the protests have been very pro-Hamas. They've kind of lauded Hamas as this noble resistance force. In fact, I'm going to read an article now from Spike magazine by Tom Slater. And this article was published on the 8th of October, the very day after the 7th of October terrorist attack happened. This was before Israel had even retaliated, although it was inevitable Israel would retaliate. Israel has retaliated through lesser terrorist attacks than this. But it was written in the aftermath of the 7th of October terrorist attack. The one that, well, shocked many of us. It shocked many of the decent of us, but as this article goes on to say, it didn't horrify everyone. And that's that itself is disturbing. So I'll read from it the important parts. In this article called Cheerleaders for Hamas, in which he says, "The woke left's response to the Islamist assault on Israel has exploded their phony moral superiority for good. First, the horror. No sooner had Hamas rolled into Israel on Saturday, murdering and kidnapping those they came across, than images of their depraved exploits were plastered across social media. Innocent people executed on the streets. A pensioner kidnapped and driven into Gaza on a golf buggy. A young woman's lifeless body, stripped almost naked, paraded on the back of a pickup truck as men spat on her and chanted Allahu Akbar. Ordinary people slaughtered and taken for no other crime than being Israeli, than being Jewish." Then the sewer. Just as social media had confronted us with such unspeakable evil, it then confronted us with those in the West who looked upon these barbaric, bloodthirsty scenes from the comfort of safe homes 2,000 miles away and thought to themselves, "Good." We have become accustomed to Hamas apologism from the woke left. There was plenty of that apologism yesterday. "Reap what you sow," tweeted Jackie Walker, former vice chair of Momentum, who was expelled from the Labour Party in 2019. But that soon began to look tame by comparison. Apologism gave way to cheerleading. Today should be a day of celebration for supporters of democracy and human rights worldwide. As Gazans break out of their open-air prison and Hamas fighters cross into their colonizers' territory, the struggle for freedom is really bloodless, and we shouldn't apologize for it. Yes, Hamas, those theocratic thugs, anti-Semitic killers, oppressors of women and gay people, are apparently champions of freedom and democracy. To call this deranged is too generous. This is psychopathic. But the brain rot wasn't confined to Brown. "All eyes on Palestine in its heroic moment of resistance against the Zionist occupation," tweeted Powell Wagen, coordinator of the Secretariat of Progressive International. Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell sit on its council. Disgraced ex-Labour MP Chris Williamson called Hamas freedom fighters. Now, that is all true. There was an outpouring of celebration from quite quite a number of the intelligentsia of the left. And it is chilling, as he describes. Now, it's hard to see the Doctor siding with that camp either. It's hard to see the Doctor endorsing that kind of a camp. It's hard to imagine most Doctor Who fans endorsing that kind of... the Doctor is someone who respects the sanctity of life. And so the idea of people on the left celebrating what Hamas did, celebrating the depraved butchery they engaged in, and basically acting with a twisted bloodlust at what Hamas did. I can't imagine any incarnation of the Doctor being in favour of this either. Or if I can, it's certainly not a Doctor I would ever want to watch. Now, I choose not to believe that everyone who gets behind the cause of, the Palestinian cause, everyone who remains behind the Palestinian cause, is as twisted as that. I don't believe even everyone who goes on the marches protesting Israel's bombardment of Gaza is as twisted as that. Many of them they just don't want war. It's a very... I don't envy anyone on the left who is well-meaning in the cause of peace, and can't turn their back on the Palestine issue. But these are their fellow travellers. If you want some kind of a rationale for why we're seeing this kind of depravity from the left, I think Nick Cohen describes it best in this article he wrote for The Spectator magazine. He wrote this in 2015, late 2015. By this point, Jeremy Corbyn had been elected the leader of the Labour Party. At this point, we'd actually had... And now, when Nick Cohen wrote this article, Nick Cohen had kind of been warning about, what the election of Jeremy Corbyn to the leader of the Labour Party meant for the left. It meant that, people were going to have to finally see what the hard left is like in action. What their ideals are really all about. And we got a glimpse of it after the Paris terrorist attacks in November that year. The November Paris terrorist attacks happened, and it was some ISIS militant terrorist scumbags decided to commit a killing spree in France. They did various coordinated attacks, and in the end, the police of Paris, arrived on the scene armed and basically shot them dead, which they had to do. I have no qualms about that. They deserved to die. They were a threat to the public. I have no qualms about what the police did there. But when Corbyn was asked, well, do you agree with that course of action? Would you approve the fact that if an attack like that happened in Britain, would you approve the police being deployed armed and ready to shoot to kill when it comes to, the threat of ISIS terrorists? And he just couldn't bring himself to say yes. He couldn't bring himself to approve the plan. He was just far too uncomfortable with the idea of the police being armed and shooting terrorists. I guess because he's a pacifist, but it did seem odd that he wasn't impassioned about the idea that yes, in that situation, it's imperative to kill the terrorists before they kill any further innocents. It's obvious that you can't reason with this person. It's obvious that they're an immediate threat to life. But Corbyn seemed to be very stubborn about his discomfort with the idea of a shoot-to-kill policy. And this this meant a huge loss of confidence in him, because his thinking just seemed very naive and woolly. It was also crucially very doctorish. It's the kind of stance the Doctor would take. I'll let that thought hang in the air, but this is, the Doctor would probably oppose a shoot-to-kill policy, or probably insist that there was a better way of resolving this. But of course, to most of the electorate, it felt like we were realizing Corbyn was not a politician we could trust to protect them. It seemed like Corbyn seemed to have more sympathy for our enemies than for the British people. It caused a bit of a media storm, and Nick Cohen weighed in on it with his take on Corbyn in this article for Spectator magazine, which he said, "Those who want to see the far left for what it is should be able to detect a pattern in his statements by now. Corbyn's response to the Paris killings was to join with other apparently moral voices and denounce the media for not giving equal space to atrocities outside Europe. You do not understand Corbyn if you reply, as Helen Lewis of The New Statesman did, that the media is full of foreign news that barely gets read, telling though a put-down was. Nor is it enough to go further and say that Corbyn does not want foreign news that contradicts his Manichean worldview. Conspiracy theories certainly riddle his far left, who dismiss reports of inconvenient war crimes as lies by corporate media designed to brainwash the masses into supporting Western imperialism. The reality, however, is worse than a mere blocking out of unpleasant truths. Corbyn and his supporters do not want us to think about Paris because they cannot accept that privileged Westerners can be victims. If ISIS kills them, it is their own or their government's fault. All you should do is mutter, blow back, and turn off the news." He points out this is just how the left views the world. It views the West and it views Israel as the evil great oppressors on the world stage, and it views Islamic terrorists, whether Hamas or ISIS or Al Qaeda, as they're the underdog. Even if they wouldn't be doing what they were doing, and if they weren't victims of the West's oppression somehow, if they weren't victims of the West keeping the Middle East down. And he said basically the reason why Corbyn couldn't bring himself to approve a shoot-to-kill policy is because he will always see the terrorist as the victim. He just cannot bring himself to see white Western Europeans killed in a terrorist attack. He can't see them as victims. He just cannot bring himself to see them as victims. He cannot bring himself to think of them as victims. And it's the same thing with this latest attack by Hamas. That's why so many people on the left cannot think of Hamas as the great evil here. And they cannot think of their Israeli victims as victims because they just have this idea of them as, well, they live this sheltered life. They don't live in the hardship of the war zones of the Middle East, of the places that America or Israel have bombarded in their wars. I think this was one unfortunate incident in which the left couldn't just dismiss it as propaganda, although it didn't stop them trying. The left, that they couldn't just dismiss this as Western propaganda because it was Hamas who live streamed what they were doing. It was Hamas propaganda. They were kind of being boastful and proud of how depraved and barbaric they were boasting of their actions in this, of their depraved, barbaric actions in this. And so the left couldn't say, oh, this is just Western propaganda. This was a situation in which a lot of the left just couldn't just dismiss this as, Western propaganda, Allied propaganda, Western imperialist propaganda. They couldn't say, oh, it was Rupert Murdoch who filmed these events and, distorted the truth, as it were. No, this is what Hamas themselves filmed. And because the left couldn't dismiss it, a lot of the left just, decided to break cover and say, okay, yeah, they did it and we don't care. We still champion Hamas. We're still going to treat them as the noble resistance here and celebrate what they did. They're not victims. That's just their worldview. Now, what gives this an uglier character, of course, is that this was an attack on Israel. This was an attack on. It was targeted on Jews by Hamas, a terrorist organization that is very explicit in its anti-Semitic ideology, in its hatred of Jews, and its belief that, you know, it is the cause of every Muslim to kill Jews everywhere until there are no Jews left. You know, it's kind of it's a doomsday prophecy that that's what needs to happen. The sick, the evil people. This is the worst pogrom we've had since the days of Nazi Germany. And it just seems very strange and very chilling that the left are at best willing to equivocate that, and at worst are willing to celebrate it. And like I said, I don't think it's all people on the left are willing to celebrate it, but they're willing to be fellow travellers with those who are. I mean, I understand a lot of leftists cannot turn their back on the issue of Palestine, particularly now that a lot of Palestinians are going to suffer. It's a rot on the left that I don't think they're ever going to be able to hide now. And, you know, I think I foresee a lot of disillusionment following this. And I think that disillusionment needs to happen. I think people do need to wake up to the rot on the left. And I think a lot of people will. But, you know, obviously a lot of Doctor Who fandom has not woken up, and, you know, a lot of them are still very much on the behind the Palestinian cause. And, you know, like I said, you know, it's very, very typical that, you know, if you speak against that party line, well, it's pretty kind of obvious what the fans in support will say. They'll say, how are you a Doctor Who fan? You know the Doctor would be opposed to this. But it's always that question, you know the Doctor would be against this. Well, I think it's time to admit something. The fact of the matter is that the Doctor is the hero he is because he's fictional. You know, he can afford himself the luxury of believing what he does, believing in the pacifist resolve, the peaceful resolve, because the writing of the show is generally on his side. You know, the stories are written to vindicate his position, and if he's presented with a moral dilemma in which he might have to do something terrible, the writing tends to give him a get-out clause. It tends to give him an easy out. The Doctor can always rely on the solutions being simple. You know, I think the more realistic of us would know that if you place the Doctor in a real-world conflict like Gaza, and, you know, he tried to negotiate a peaceful settlement there, he tried his non-violent methods there, he probably would not last 5 minutes. And of course, because he wouldn't last 5 minutes, the show wouldn't last 5 minutes. So the show is written in a way so that his methods do work. And, you know, things are never quite as bad as they are in the real world. So I think that's kind of the problem with taking the Doctor as your guide in life. I tend to think, if you think that, you know, you can live by the Doctor's values all the time in all situations, then you've probably lived a bit of a sheltered life. And a lot of fans have. I think, you know, Doctor Who fandom, it's a very, very middle-class pursuit. Doctor Who fandom has a very, very middle-class character to it. I mean, when Doctor Who first began in 1963, there was no conception that this Doctor was supposed to represent any kind of, you know, any kind of noble high ideals, you know, and he certainly wasn't supposed to be this figure who was a paragon of social justice and peacemaking. Like when you're first introduced to the Doctor in the pilot episode An Unearthly Child, you were given no indication whatsoever that he's going to be any kind of hero in the show. There's nothing heroic about this Doctor. He's quite sinister, in fact. He's kind of the villain of the piece. You know, his main agenda in the show at that point is just, you know, self-preservation, you know, saving himself. And, you know, basically the only thing he really cares about is saving himself and Susan from any trouble. So he will often he will kind of say, well, I'm not going to get involved in this conflict between the Thals and the Daleks. I'm not going to get involved in trying to stop the Aztecs from sacrificing people to their gods. It's not, I don't believe in getting involved in, issues like that. I don't believe in taking a stand. I'm not a hero, essentially. That's what William Hartnell's Doctor was like. William Hartnell's Doctor was actually quite a mercenary figure, quite a capricious figure, actually. The Doctor is very reticent to take any kind of sides in it at all and says, you know what, it doesn't concern us. We should just look after our own. Leave these people to deal with their conflict their way. It's nothing to do with us. He was just self-serving. He just cared about saving himself and Susan, and kind of saving Ian and Barbara, but even they were kind of a bit expendable to him at first. And so even in the Daleks and the Dalek Invasion of Earth, he doesn't want to get involved in the Thal's fight with the Daleks, even though he's seen evidence of how evil the Daleks can be. And in the Dalek Invasion of Earth, he just wants to slip away. He doesn't really want to concern himself with the fight against the Daleks. But gradually over the time, over the course of the serial, he realizes, that he does have to take a moral stand here. And by the end of the Hartnell era, he regenerated into Patrick Troughton, and that's where the idea of the Doctor as a moral hero came to the fore. The idea that he felt it was his duty to fight the evils of the universe and to save mankind from the Daleks and the Cybermen. Now, even so, at this point, you would not have really described the Doctor as a pacifist. The idea of the Doctor as a pacifist came more in the Pertwee era, in stories like the Silurians and the Sea Devils and Frontier in Space, in which the point is made that the Doctor doesn't think, the Doctor, he encounters the Silurians, he encounters the Sea Devils, and his approach is not to wage war on them. He's not to treat them as a threat. It's to try and understand them and try to understand their grievances against mankind and try to bring both sides to a peaceful settlement. And of course, the human military is what screws it up for him. And that's where you kind of got a bit more of the character of the Doctor as being a man of peace and, somebody who abhors violence and prefers negotiation. But it was a gradual thing, and it was kind of very specific to those stories, I would say. The problem is, I don't think that was ever really meant to become... It certainly was never a dominant trait of the character of the Doctor at the beginning, and I'm not sure it was ever really meant to become his dominant trait, but it did become his dominant trait. It became... Pertwee's Doctor was kind of more defined by it than Doctors before. And the problem is, as the show went on, it kind of basically that became the Doctor's defining trait, was his belief in peace and pacifism and rejection of war, rejection of military methods. And I guess the problem is that the Doctor basically became Flanderized. It says here, Flanderization is the act of taking a single, often minor action or trait of a character within a work and exaggerating it more and more over time until it completely consumes the character. Most always, the trait or action becomes completely outlandish and it becomes their defining characteristic, turning them into a caricature of their former selves. The trope is named for the Simpsons character Ned Flanders, who was originally depicted as a friendly, generous Christian neighbour and a model father, husband and citizen, making him a contrast to Homer Simpson. As seasons progressed, however, he became increasingly, obsessively religious to the point where he eventually embodied almost every negative stereotype of the God-fearing, Bible-thumping American Christian evangelist. Now, I think it's no secret that that is kind of what has happened to the Doctor over time. That this idea of him as the more peace-loving figure, that became his Flanderization. It kind of got to the point where this became the Doctor's religious dogma of sorts. The belief, that die-hard belief that violence was always wrong and reason, negotiation and peace would always win out. It had to win out. And this is something the Doctor was dogged and die-hard about. This is something the Doctor became dogged and die-hard about, even when the truth staring him in the face was that it wasn't going to work, or even when past experience should have told him otherwise. And I think we can kind of all admit to ourselves that this is what has happened to the Doctor as a character. Over time he's become more and more so defined by the idea of being this pacifist peacemaker that it dominates all else about the character. And a lot of people say, yeah, well, that's the problem with the new series. That's the problem with Jodie's Doctor. She's been flanderized into being this virtue-signaling pacifist idiot. But it didn't start with Jodie. It didn't start with David Tennant even. I would say it started with Peter Davison. It started in stories like The Visitation and Warriors of the Deep. Stories in which the Doctor, isn't some wizened figure who sees an opportunity to lay the ground for a peaceful resolve. It seems now that the Doctor is more a delusional utopianist who is convinced that peace and pacifism and negotiation can always work over violence. And he was very diehard about trying to the bitter end to get enemies to see reason, even when common sense and indeed past experience should tell him otherwise. That's where the Doctor began to become flanderized to the point of becoming turned into an idiot, frankly. And to the point where it was kind of almost evangelical with him. He just would not see the real world. He would not see the reality of the situation for what it was anymore. And in fact, if you watch the episode The Android Invasion from Tom Baker's era, in which the Doctor has to deal with the threat of the Kralls, and he also kind of finds himself talking to one of the human agents, this lost astronaut called Guy Crayford, who is helping the Kralls to infiltrate Earth society. And he's asking Guy Crayford why he's doing this, and Guy Crayford kind of insists that the Kralls are non-hostile and that they can be reasonable.
But the Kralls have promised me that no humans will be harmed, as long as they obey the ultimatum that's been prepared. You see, the Kralls are going to take over the northern hemisphere and live in peace. I have their word for it.
You've been brainwashed, Crayford.
In hindsight, that scene could almost be something from a multi-Doctor story where the Fourth Doctor is talking to the Fifth Doctor. Because that's kind of what the Doctor would become flanderized into. He'd become flanderized into the deluded Guy Crayford character.
I sometimes wonder why I like the people of this miserable planet so much. The Silurians and Sea Devils are noble races. They have skills and talents you pathetic humans can only dream about.
Tell me, if your Kral friends are so unviolent, why did Stigron try to vaporize me?
Oh, yes. Well, they thought you were a danger. You see, now, Miss Smith's memory prints had shown up your intense past involvement in the defense of Earth.
He was just desperate to believe in the peaceful and benign intentions of the enemy. And that's what Russell T Davies inherited when he brought the show back. He inherited a flanderized pacifist character in the Doctor. And, Russell T Davies, being a fan, always had this idea that, well, that's what the Doctor needs to be. He needs to be, devoted to the cause of peace. But in order to sell that to an audience, then, the show has to be tailor-made. The stories have to be written and tailor-made to accommodate the idea that the Doctor's ways and methods can always work. Or at the very least, if they don't work, there's a convenient out for him. Because, it's obvious that, in the real world, a figure like the Doctor, a peace-loving figure like the Doctor, if you placed him in the situation going on in Gaza right now between Israel and Hamas, the Doctor in real life would not last 5 minutes. And of course, because he wouldn't last 5 minutes, the show wouldn't last 5 minutes. And so the show has to kind of contrive ways that the Doctor can survive. The fiction is kind of tailor-made so that his ways prevail and that he wins the day. And even in something like Parting of the Ways, where the Doctor's faced with this moral dilemma of, well, things have gotten so bad that I'm going to need to press the delta wave switch. I'm going to have to condemn the Daleks and the humans mutually to destruction. I need to destroy the Daleks. The humans are going to be unfortunate, innocent collateral once I press the delta wave switch. But in the end, the Doctor can't do it. And it's Rose who arrives on the scene. Rose kind of looks into the heart of the TARDIS. She draws from the power of the TARDIS. And she arrives on the scene, and she's able to spare the Doctor the need to press the button by disintegrating the entire Dalek fleet and leaving the humans unharmed. So, there's always an out for the Doctor, in which he never really has to compromise on his principles. And so it gives the impression that the Doctor's ways can always win. And I think the more sensible fans know that. The more sensible fans know that the show is just a bit of escapism. We know that the Doctor's ways are never going to work in the real world. But, for 45 minutes we can watch a show and enjoy the escapism of a world in which the Doctor can win, and which, a good person like the Doctor does win the day. It would be lovely if real life was like that. It isn't, but it's a nice bit of escapism. I think fans who take the ideals of the Doctor as something to live by, however, at this point, have probably lived a bit of a sheltered life. And I think that's just characteristic of Doctor Who fandom. Doctor Who fandom has a very, very middle-class character to it. But the problem is, a character like that, to me, only really worked back in the 70s. And it's been very, very difficult to sustain that kind of idealistic character since then, although fans have always, once fandom got involved in making the show, once, you had fans like Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat and Chibnall writing for the show, they had to maintain that. They had to kind of try and, because they were fans, they tried to make the Doctor more saintly and much more of a paragon of virtue, an almost impossible paragon of virtue, an almost impossible prophet of progressiveness. And it's getting to the point where it's maybe unsustainable, and there's always going to be times when reality intrudes. The horrors of the real world intrude. And this is very much one of those times. October the 7th was a watershed moment, and I think it's going to change a lot about politics and about fandom as well, I think. So, what would the Doctor do?
There's still time to save your own lives.
There are millions more ready to replace us.
Who will replace you? With you dies the last of the Triad. The custodians of your race. What will become of your people then?
You talk in vain, Doctor. Kill them! Kill them!
Frankly, who cares? The Doctor's an idiot. Has been for decades. This is Sadako24, signing out.